Before I even roll the benchmarks, I'm going to respond to the question I know I'm going to get, which is why compare a 3080 against a 4090? And I'm going to give you 3 reasons. Number 1, because if you're considering buying a GPU right now for the pretty high-end experience, either at higher refresh rate 1440p or going into 4K gaming, I think the 3080 on the NVIDIA side is kind of the best value, because if you go lower performance than that, you're really, pushing the kind of experience that you're going to get. And then if you go higher than that with like a 3090 or 3090 Ti, I think there's a lot of diminishing returns on the value. Whereas the 4090 represents, what if I just throw value out the window and buy the best of the best? Is it worth it? What is the difference? Number 2 reason why I'm comparing them is a lot of people who bought an RTX 3080 in the first year and a half of its existence probably paid around what a 4090 costs now, due to the whole crypto mining and whatnot, chip shortage, everything. In other words, the people who bought 3080s have one now, and now they're looking at the 4090, should I upgrade, might have already been used to buying in this, $1,700 plus price range. And number 3 reason is because it's actually the personal situation I'm most familiar with. I've been gaming on my 3080 12GB, and we are testing a 12GB version in this video. I've been gaming on the 3080 12GB as my main gaming GPU for the last, 6 months or so, and now I've switched to the 4090, tested it out extensively, and I can give you my thoughts on what it is like to switch from one to the other, and how worthwhile is the upgrade. Because it absolutely is an upgrade, but how worthwhile? In this video, we're testing out the RTX 3080 12GB. It's the Gigabyte Eagle version at its stock out-of-the-box settings, and we're testing out the 4090 Gigabyte Gaming OC version at its stock out-of-the-box settings. And they are both running fine on my 850 watt power supply and my R9 5950X, 32 gigabytes of 3600 CL16 memory. That's the test system. Let's roll the benchmarks. Let's start by taking a look at Plague Tale Requiem. This game is incredibly demanding, and your 3080 12GB is not going to be maxing it out at 4K Ultra, at least without, DLSS or something like that. This game is even demanding on consoles because it's not looking for console backwards compatibility with the last generation. And so as we start to see next-gen consoles only, and I think they're pushed into 1440p 30 FPS in this game, we'll start to see, I think, system requirements go way up soon. And that's something to think about. However, the 3080 does have DLSS quality available to it, and that does help it stay over 60 FPS a lot of the time, although definitely not all of the time in this game. However, the 4090 also has DLSS quality available, and we can see that it's over 100 FPS at 4K. So we can see that the 4090 is enabling a truly high refresh rate 4K experience here, especially if you're willing to use DLSS quality. Now, if we look at these GPUs at 1440p Ultra, and this is the native 1440p Ultra without DLSS, the 3080 12GB is over 60 FPS here, although not by a whole lot, and there are more demanding scenes in this one, whereas the 4090 is almost doubling its performance with over 120 FPS in the same scene, which is extremely impressive. Now I want to look at the 4090 against the 4090, and let's talk about DLSS frame generation. We have DLSS quality on the left, DLSS quality with frame generation on the right. And one thing you want to look at here is the image quality. I'm actually very happy with the image quality of frame generation in this game. We'll talk about Spider-Man in a minute, but the image quality here I thought looked pretty good. This game moves pretty slow paced. If you try to swing the camera around fast, which honestly, if you're playing this game with a controller, you'd never really do, I think I can get a little bit of image breakup around the edges of the character. Here's it compared to DLSS quality, which I think is just a little bit more stable around the edges. And I can try to show them side by side, but honestly, guys, I don't think this is picking up really well in the YouTube video, and YouTube compression will kill a lot of it in motion as well. But I'll say that I actually like the image quality. I'm trying to slow it down here a bit, but I think frame generation looks pretty good in this game, especially how you'd actually play the game, and especially if you're using a controller. DLSS frame generation also can boost your frame rates in CPU limited situations. We can see ourselves not getting much boost from DLSS quality because we are CPU limited. Look at the GPU utilization in the middle screen here. Whereas DLSS frame generation can significantly boost the frame rate. It's actually boosting it past 120 FPS, which is a problem, and the main reason why I am not using frame generation in this game. My monitor's 120 Hz, and DLSS frame generation is not compatible with VSync. You can try to force it on, but it introduces horrible input latency. I actually did not mind the input latency added by just using DLSS frame generation, but I hated the screen tearing. Now, in Plague Tale, I liked the image quality. In Spider-Man, I don't. As he moves quickly over objects, because it's a much faster-paced game with more rapid camera swinging and Spider-Man swinging, you can watch as he climbs over this building and shoots past this building and back over it. I'll try slowing it down here for you to see it easier, but in person this was actually very noticeable to me. And so in Spider-Man, even if VSync worked properly, and even though it's helping me in CPU limited situations, which Spider-Man has a lot of, I'm not using frame generation. So in the two games that I actually have that support frame generation, I'm not using it. Both of them because they don't support VSync well, which is a problem, and I get screen tearing, and in Spider-Man because of the image quality. However, the input latency at the high frame rates I was running at, and in these types of games, not a competitive shooter, a single-player game, the input latency didn't bother me unless I tried to force on VSync, in which case the input latency was horrible. Now, here we're seeing DLSS quality rather than DLSS frame generation in the same scene, and I think you guys would agree, it's hard to say how well it shows up on YouTube, that I think this looks better. I think there's less breakup as Spider-Man moves quickly over objects, but also look at the frame rate. The frame rate is much lower, and I'm definitely CPU bottlenecked here, badly, and I'm on an R9 5950X. I know there's better CPUs out there these days, but this game can get incredibly CPU bottlenecked. I'm slowing it down here a bit here at DLSS quality. It's not exactly the same movements I made for frame generation, but this isn't really a scripted benchmark, it's just me web swinging around. But I don't really see the breakup in image quality anywhere near the way I do with frame generation because, well, it's just a different technology and has different issues. So long story short, I'm not using DLSS frame generation in either of the titles that support it. Now, let's go ahead and look at the 3080 12GB up against the RTX 4090 in Spider-Man Remastered. Here we're running 4K very high RT with no DLSS. And you could see that in that beginning scene, the RTX 4090 was getting significantly better frame rates, almost double. But you can see here, it's not that far ahead, and that's because it's CPU limited. Look at the GPU utilization on the 4090. It's nowhere near 100% because I'm getting CPU limited. And actually look at how it's bringing down the power. The 4090 here is only using around 280 watts. Now, if we enable DLSS quality, the 4090 doesn't really gain any performance because it's still CPU limited, whereas the 3080 12GB is starting to catch up to the RTX 4090 because, again, it had more room to gain from lowering the resolution through DLSS. So it's really an interesting situation here. Now, again, if you have the latest CPU, you do a little better here in your 4090, but even then, you might end up CPU limited. The 5950X isn't that far behind some of the newest generation as of the time of filming. Now, here we're seeing frame generation on the right versus DLSS quality on the left because the 3080 doesn't support frame generation. So if you're willing to use frame generation, it can help you in CPU limited situations here. And now you can see us kind of almost doubling the performance of the 3080 again. But like I said, for me, the image quality and the screen tearing are too much of a problem with frame generation for me to use personally. Now let's switch to some other games. How about Cyberpunk 2077? Now, if you try to play this game at 4K Ultra, you can see that the 3080 12GB simply can't give you a high refresh rate experience, whereas the 4090 is going to be over 60 FPS most of the time, although we did still see some dips below 60 FPS, even on the 4090. And guys, I don't even have ray tracing turned on yet. But we can definitely see good performance here. We can see that the 4090 is drawing more power. Interestingly here, we're under 400 watts, whereas in Plague Tale, we saw it going up more to its 450 watt power target, which again is interesting. We can also see that the GPU cooler is definitely keeping up on the 4090. Like I said, I have the Gigabyte Gaming OC version and it hasn't had any issues cooling it. Now keep in mind, just because it's keeping the GPU cool doesn't mean it's not exhausting tons of wattage worth of heat into your case. So that's that's certainly something to look at. Also, just a reminder not to judge the smoothness of the experience based on what you see. Look at the frame time graph. The image capture doesn't always show this, the smoothness of the capture because you're seeing 60 FPS video, whereas I'm on a variable refresh rate screen, so it's not always matching up. Now, if we enable the settings you would actually probably play with on a 3080, if you're playing at 4K, when I played this game at 4K on my 3080, I basically went with the high settings with DLSS quality, and it keeps me over 60 FPS most of the time. But if we put those same settings on the RTX 4090, we can actually see that we're well over 100 FPS, and actually, if you keep an eye on the GPU usage, the 4090 is now actually slightly held back by my CPU. You'll see it especially as we cross the street in this little bit further section of the benchmark. But we can see that, it's mostly getting its full performance. We're at 94% there rather than the full, 99% or something like that. And again, if you actually look at the power draw right now, the 4090 is reporting about the same power draw, if not a little bit less than the 3080 12GB. And producing significantly higher frame rates at the same setting. Let's go ahead and take a look at the actual results, where the 3080 is getting 72.5 average, whereas we're getting over 120 FPS average for the 4090. Massive difference. But that doesn't mean that the 4090 can just max out the game, because the maximum settings in this game are ultra settings plus all the ultra ray tracing plus manually changing the RT lighting up to Psycho. Now, I'm not showing it to you at native because you can see right here, even with DLSS quality, the 4090 actually dips below 60 FPS. Whereas the 3080, notice this is not a like-for-like test. The 3080 is just not able to get a 60 FPS experience at maximum settings at 4K in this game, even going down to DLSS Performance. You can get closer if you go to DLSS Ultra Performance, but honestly, that looks so bad. There's so many little moire issues and just lack of detail and aliasing all over the place. Honestly, even DLSS Performance to me is not usable on a high-end situation. I would much rather turn the settings down. But you can see here that the 4090 with DLSS quality, which still looks pretty good, can enable you to max out the ray tracing in Cyberpunk, although we've seen that they're going to be adding an even higher demanding ray tracing overdrive setting, which, wow, if it's more demanding than this, that's going to be pretty crazy. Now, what we're looking at here, again, is not a like-for-like comparison. What I want to look at here, again, is if you actually wanted to play the game with ray tracing on a 3080 at 4K, what sort of settings might you want to use? And here we're seeing, if you use RT reflections, you can use DLSS Performance to be over 60 FPS a lot of the time. Whereas on the 4090, if you want to go with those RT Psycho settings, if you go down to DLSS Balanced, which is a little more aggressive than we saw last time on the previous benchmark, you're actually going to be over 60 FPS a lot more of the time, and I would be a lot happier with the frame rate. Now, I'm not sure if these are the settings I would actually use, because to me, I can spot some downgrades to being at DLSS Balanced versus, native or even DLSS quality. Although DLSS Balance still does look quite good. Now, this also gives you guys a chance to see, is RT Psycho worth it? You're seeing it up against just RT Reflections at the Ultra settings. The lighting is better with RT Psycho, but the game still looks quite good without it, so it's kind of up to you how you want to go there, and maybe that high refresh rate settings make more sense to you. But, you might also be considering these GPUs for 1440p, so we'll throw some of those tests in here as well. We can see that the 3080 12GB at 1440p Ultra does well, although it's not a super high refresh rate experience. Enabling DLSS quality does get it to a higher refresh rate experience, whereas the 4090 at 1440p Ultra with no DLSS is actually a little bit CPU limited. If you look at the GPU usage percentage on my 4090, you'll see that it's frequently dipping into the lower 90% range, meaning that it's probably being held back by the CPU. but not by much. So again, if you had an even faster CPU, you might get slightly better performance here on the 4090 at 1440p Ultra. And that's actually just one thing that we'll kind of see throughout these tests is that if you're thinking about using the 4090 as a high refresh rate 1440p GPU, you really want to make sure you have the absolute fastest CPU available. Because like I said, 5950X isn't the fastest thing around anymore, but it's not slow, and it has trouble keeping up with the 4090 at 1440p in a lot, not every, but a lot of situations. But can we max the game out at 1440p? Well, on the 3080 12GB, what if we wanted to use some ray tracing? Well, if you use RT Ultra with DLSS quality, the 3080 12GB is dipping below 60 FPS, but a lot of times it's also over 60 FPS. You'll average around 60. Whereas the 4090 can use the RT Psycho settings, completely max the game out without DLSS, but in a lot of scenes it's still around 60 FPS. Although if you do then enable DLSS quality, you see a massive performance gain from the 4090. And you can see you can get a high refresh rate, absolute maximum settings, other than going down to DLSS quality on the 4090. So, ray tracing Psycho high refresh rate on a 4090, absolutely possible. But for the high refresh rate, you do need DLSS still. So, is there room for NVIDIA to market a 4090 Ti? I mean, there are games that you aren't able to max out at native settings with a high refresh rate, even on a 4090. I mean, there's always room for more frames, right, guys? But let's go ahead and, just for fun, take a look at 1080p here. Can both of these GPUs max out Cyberpunk at 1080p? And you might have thought the 3080 12GB could do it, but it actually can't. I mean, it can, but can it do it at the kinds of frame rates you'd probably expect a 3080 to get at 1080p? No, you're well below 60 FPS most of the time. The 4090, on the other hand, is closer to the 100 FPS, definitely a high refresh rate experience, and once again, depending on the scene, can even be slightly held back by the CPU here. And again, enabling ray tracing settings actually increases CPU workload, which is interesting, and a lot of people don't realize that. It is incredibly demanding on the GPU, but ray tracing also increases the CPU draw calls, and it does reduce the maximum, like right here, you're seeing it right here, look at the 4090. It's dropping into the 80-something% GPU utilization here because of CPU limits as we went through that populated area in the city center. So, interesting test, but I don't think 1080p is going to be the target resolution unless you're playing competitive games on like are the 500 hertz monitors out yet? I don't know. Anyway, here we're going to look at some other games. So let's look at some more ray tracing. This is Guardians of the Galaxy at 4K with the game with the ultra settings, but then with all of the RT settings turned on as well. This game has ray traced reflections. And we can see that the 3080 12GB was struggling, so I just kicked on DLSS quality to see how well it could try to catch up. And you can see that the game is playable with DLSS quality with RT Max, although it's, not a super high refresh rate experience. The 4090 is still winning even at the native resolution. So certainly a win here for the 4090, although the 3080 is certainly playable. Now, I played this game on the 3080 and actually turned down the settings on ray tracing a little bit and got a lot better performance. But here we'll go ahead and look at the RT Max settings at 1440p, and we can see that the 4090 is actually CPU limited again. Look at the GPU utilization, we're dropping down around 81%, now down to 78, 77%, so there's certainly a lot more headroom for the 4090 if you have a faster CPU, so certainly keep that in mind. And once again, that's one of the things that we're going to see here. The 4090 can deliver crazy 1440p refresh rates in a lot of games. You're going to have a lot of trouble getting a CPU that can keep up. But if you turn off ray tracing, the 4090 is actually CPU limited at 4K Ultra. Once again, look at the GPU utilization, and we're only getting about 82% out of the 4090. Here, we went up higher there for a bit, a little bit lower. But yeah, the 4090 is CPU limited at 4K Ultra in this game. And I mean, you're getting all the frame rates you need, so probably just, lock the frame rate where you want it to be. But let's go ahead and look at Shadow of the Tomb Raider and look at ray tracing again. So this is the game, I switched it over to the highest preset and then turned on ray traced shadows to Ultra. So this game only features ray traced shadows. So it's not the most impressive ray tracing situation. And I went ahead and kicked on DLSS for the 3080 to see how much it could try to catch up to the 4090. And it doesn't catch up, but it does get you a well over 60 FPS experience now. So you certainly could play the game at 4K if you don't mind DLSS quality, which actually looks pretty good at 4K. And in this game even brings you in some more details from a distance with the increased LOD bias, I think. Anyway, but 4090 doing an excellent job here. Now, if we turn off the ray tracing and just look at the 4K, when I say highest, I mean the highest preset. That's actually the name of the preset in this Shadow of the Tomb Raider game. We can see basically doubling the performance. They both did well, though. And 1440p, they can both easily max out the game's ray traced settings with high refresh rates, although we can actually see the 4090 here doubling the performance of the 3080. So let's jump over to God of War. Now, this is a pretty demanding game, but not as demanding as, Plague Tale Requiem, and it's also not ray tracing. So here we're seeing 4K ultra settings, and as he turns the corner here, this is more typical of actual gameplay. We can see the 3080 a little over 60 FPS. If we add in DLSS quality, which is how I played the game, I played it at ultra settings with DLSS quality enabled and did well. The 4090, though, is around 120 frames per second. So again, that 4K dream of high refresh rate is alive. At 1440p, they're both delivering an excellent experience. And, extreme settings here in Forza Horizon 5, as well as extreme frame rates. So we're going to look at some games pretty quickly now, where we can just see that a lot of games, the 3080 already delivers a high refresh rate experience at 4K. So it's not really all that interesting. The 4090 delivers an even higher refresh rate and is still CPU limited. Look at the GPU utilization. We could have got more out of it if we had an even faster CPU. And I do have resizable bar enabled, and this is on the driver update that gave us some increased performance in this game, which is nice to see. So remember, the 4090 would have done even better here if it wasn't CPU limited. Crazy that you're CPU limited at those frame rates at 4K. Anyway, 4K ultimate settings in Horizon Zero Dawn, to look at other Horizons here, we're once again getting incredibly high maximum settings, frame rates at 4K on the 4090, although the 3080 is getting very good settings as well. So, I mean, they both did great, excellent. So not a lot to say there. If you look at it at 1440p, the RTX 4090 is so CPU limited that it is doing better than the 3080, but not by that much. But once again, it's not that it's not that much better than the 3080, it's just that it's at such a high refresh rate that my 5950X can't keep up, so you would have seen a much bigger gap there. Not that it matters when the frame rates are this high. Both of them are as high as you would need in a game like that. So let's take a look at Red Dead Redemption 2, where we see at the favor quality maximum, so I slid the preset slider all the way to the right, the 4090 is delivering a high refresh rate, maxed out experience again. Again, I would have to kick on VSync or a frame rate limiter to stop screen tearing, which I can because I'm not using the DLSS frame generation because this game doesn't have it. 3080 12GB with DLSS quality can get you a higher refresh rate experience, but still comes nowhere near the 4090. And I have mixed feelings about DLSS in this game. It cleans up some of the TAA in the game, but it also, I think, makes the hair look kind of bad. So anyway, there's the end of benchmark results. If you go ahead and look at it at 1440p, we're once again seeing the 4090 a bit CPU limited by my 5950X. Look at that GPU utilization. It's dropping into the mid-80s, but they're both delivering such high refresh rate experience, it doesn't really matter. So we've seen the comparison. Is it worth it to buy a 4090 over a 3080? Well, I hope you guys were convinced that the 3080 can absolutely still deliver a solid 4K gaming experience, but it's usually targeting a 60 FPS, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less, and you do have to tweak settings, use DLSS and things like that to get there. Now, there's certainly less demanding games where you can go a lot higher refresh rate at 4K, that's absolutely true, but we're talking mostly about more graphically demanding experiences that are coming out recently. Now, the RTX 4090 at 4K, it's much more reasonable to expect a 120 Hz 4K monitor to not go to waste, and we actually saw issues with needing to frame cap in order to not go above the 120 Hz monitor and get screen tearing, which brings me to the topic of DLSS frame generation. So as I explained in the video, I have it available in 2 games right now, Spider-Man and Plague Tale Requiem, both of which I am actively playing, and I tried turning on frame generation for quite a long time in both games, and in both of them I ended up turning it off. So in my limited experience with the games that I have, that I actually play, that are available with now, my answer to is DLSS 3 worth it is no, although I'm excited for the feature, and I think there could end up being places where it's worthwhile. For me, the biggest issue is when my game goes above my monitor's refresh rate, I can't cap it, and I get screen tearing, and that's ugly, and I don't like it. In Spider-Man, I had some more issues with the actual image quality of the frame generation itself, but I thought it looked very good in Plague Tale Requiem. And I didn't have issues with the latency that it adds, which it does add, in single-player games. Especially, these are both games that I would play on a controller. When actually using my mouse, which I wouldn't normally do in those games, I could feel a slight increase in the latency, although I have a feeling a lot of people wouldn't. I don't play a lot of competitive first-person shooters these days, but, in my youth, I did play a lot of competitive CSGO type games like that. And so I can feel a slight increase to the, floatiness of the mouse movements. They don't feel as precise. But I think for the vast majority of people, the kind of frame rates you're playing at here, it's not going to be that big of a deal, and especially if you're playing a game with a controller. I do not think you'd want to use it in a competitive esport title. It gets you higher frame rates, but the whole reason you want higher frame rates in an esports title is for reduced latency, and this does not give you that. It gives you increased latency, although I am happy that more games will add NVIDIA Reflex because they're forced to do it to support DLSS frame generation. So that's kind of an added side benefit of this technology for people who don't have the 40 series GPUs and can support it. So I'm going to keep my eye on this feature, but overall, in the few situations where the 4090 needs any frame rate benefit, DLSS quality of the old-fashioned variety gets the job done without the added latency and without the incompatibility with VSync. So I'm just not in a situation where I see frame generation being useful to me. Maybe that would change in the future. Now, at 1440p, I think the 4090 is kind of overkill. I think the RTX 3080 still gives a very, very good 1440p gaming experience, and we saw that in incredibly demanding ray tracing titles like Cyberpunk. No, the 3080 can't completely max out the ray tracing settings, but there's diminishing returns on the image quality you're getting for that anyway, and you could go aggressive with DLSS if you're willing to tolerate that trade-off, if you really do want to max it out. The 4090 is certainly an incredibly future-proof 1440p card. There's always a limit to how future-proof you can get, but man, does it crush 1440p. The bigger issue you're going to run into is whether or not your CPU can keep up, because mine certainly couldn't in most of those games. Now, it can keep up well enough that I could then just set my frame rate limit to something I'm happy with, lock to it, and the nice thing actually about the fact that the 4090 is so powerful that it can go to such high refresh rates that you might not even need that refresh rate is then when you do set a frame rate limit, the GPU doesn't use that much power. It's actually fairly power efficient, and you can see actually in the screenshot I have frozen behind me right now that the 4090 is actually using less power than the 3080 because it's CPU limited. So it is actually pretty efficient at frames per watt. It's just that it's able to draw a huge number of watts to go to a huge number of frames if you need it to. If you limit it, that certainly helps out. And like I said, I'm having no problems running it on my 850 watt power supply, so that just has, and we saw that in not every game does it actually try to draw 450 watts, but we saw my power supply certainly could deliver it with no issues. Now you probably do want a good quality 850 watt power supply, and also the 5950X CPU I'm using isn't as power hungry as like a 12900K or a 13900K. So if you're going to pair it with, especially if you're going to overclock a CPU like that along with it, I do think you might want to think about an even higher end power supply. Anyway, guys, The 4090 is absolutely ridiculously powerful, although we did see some games where, especially at 4K, I mean, there is room for more power if you just really don't want to turn down settings and you still want a high refresh rate. But overall, 4090 is enabling a high refresh rate 4K experience for really the first time ever, whereas the 3080 12GB gives you a good 4K experience and a great 1440p experience with no trouble. So if you're in the financial position where spending the crazy amounts of money that 4090 costs is fine for you and you really want to go for 4K high refresh rate gaming, I do think it is worth it if, again, that amount of money is not something irresponsible for you to spend on your hobby, right? Whereas the 3080 12GB, I think, does offer a very, very good experience at a much, much more wallet-friendly price. So anyway, I'm sure I'll be doing other comparisons, more thoughts in the future, especially as more GPUs come out. I hope all of you have an excellent day.